There was a diner on the corner of Fifth and Maple that most people barely noticed anymore. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths, a flickering neon sign that hadn't been replaced since 1987, and coffee that tasted the same whether you ordered it at breakfast or midnight. The waitresses knew the menu by heart, and every evening just after 7 o'clock, an old man would walk through the door, sit at the same table by the window, and eat dinner completely alone. His name was Thomas Brennan, though no one at the diner knew that. He never complained, never made small talk, never looked anyone in the eye for longer than it took to nod his thanks when the plate arrived. The waitresses had a quiet understanding about him. Don't ask questions, don't hover, just bring the food and let him be. Hands resting on the table like they were waiting for someone who would never come, that made even the chattiest server go quiet. Loneliness has a presence. It just exists, heavy and patient, like fog settling over a field at dawn. Thomas had been coming to the diner for 3 years. Same table, same time, same silence. And in all that time, no one had ever sat across from him. Until one night in late October, when everything changed. It started the way most overlooked moments do, ordinary, unremarkable, easily forgotten. Thomas had just taken his first bite of pot pie when the door opened and a young woman stepped inside. She looked to be in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail and a canvas jacket that had seen better days. She stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room with the kind of hesitation that suggested she wasn't sure she belonged there. The diner was half empty, as it usually was on Thursday nights. Plenty of open tables, plenty of space to sit alone. It wasn't until her shadow fell across the table that he looked up, startled, his fork pausing midair. She didn't smile, didn't apologize, not asking for permission so much as testing whether he would refuse. Thomas blinked, didn't explain. Should he? I'm Clara, she said, still looking out the window. He set his fork down carefully, as if the wrong movement might shatter whatever strange spell had settled over the table. Just kept staring out at the street, at the orange glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like it had weight, like it meant something neither of them had words for yet. The waitress came by, a middle-aged woman named Diane, who had worked at the diner longer than anyone could remember. Just coffee, black. Diane nodded and walked away, casting one last curious look over her shoulder. Thomas picked up his fork again, but he didn't eat. He just held it, his eyes flicking between his plate and the woman sitting across from him. She didn't seem to expect anything from him, didn't seem to need conversation or explanation. She just sat there, present in a way that felt both intrusive and comforting at the same time. Minutes passed. The coffee arrived. Why did you sit here? It wasn't accusatory, just genuinely curious. She took another sip of coffee, her expression unreadable. I don't know, she said eventually. I guess I didn't want to sit alone. Thomas considered this. It was an honest answer, but it didn't quite explain why she had chosen his table. Why him? Why now? There are other tables, he said quietly. I know. Another silence. This one longer. And routine was all he had left. Clara didn't order food. She seemed to be waiting for something, though Thomas couldn't imagine what. When he finally finished his meal, he set his fork down with a quiet clink and reached for his wallet. He counted out the exact bills, added his usual tip, and placed them neatly on the edge of the table. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know what she wanted from him. I'll be here, she added, her tone casual, as if she were simply stating a fact. As he stepped out into the cold October air, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Just the bare essentials, a couch, a bed, a table with one chair. Everything in his life had been reduced to function, to survival, to getting through one day so he could get through the next. God, did he understand them? But understanding didn't make them easier to accept, because loneliness for Thomas wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice he had made, a necessary distance he had put between himself and the rest of the world. And now this stranger, this woman he didn't know, had crossed that distance without asking. He didn't know what to do with that. When morning came, he went through his usual routine: shower, coffee, toast with butter. The newspaper, though he rarely read past the first page anymore. Then him, then the diner. He tried not to think about the evening, tried not to wonder if she would actually be there. But the thought crept in anyway, persistent and unwelcome. And there, in his spot by the window, sat Clara. She was already there, waiting. Thomas felt his heart do something strange, a little flutter, a small acceleration. He took a breath, steadied himself, and walked inside. The bell above the door chimed. Clara looked up and met his eyes. She didn't smile, but there was something in her expression, recognition, maybe, or relief. Thomas walked to the table and sat down across from her, just as he had the night before, except this time he was the one choosing to sit. "Hi," Thomas replied. And just like that, it became their routine. Thomas would order his usual meal. They would sit in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging a word or two, but never pushing for more. It was enough just to be there, to not be alone. But slowly, over the course of days and then weeks, the silence began to fill with words. It started small. Clara mentioned the weather. Thomas commented on the pot pie being drier than usual. She asked if he had always lived in the area. One night, about 2 weeks in, Clara showed up with a book. A worn paperback with a cracked spine and dog-eared pages. She set it on the table between them and took a sip of her coffee. "Do you read?" she asked. Thomas glanced at the book. "Sometimes. This one's good. Mystery, old-school detective stuff. The kind where you actually have to pay attention to figure it out." He nodded, unsure what else to say. She slid the book across the table. "You can borrow it if you want. I thought you might like it." He hesitated, then picked up the book, running his thumb along the edge of the pages. It had been a long time since anyone had given him anything. A long time since anyone had thought about what he might like. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't mention it." But it had been there. The nights continued. Clara kept coming. Thomas kept waiting. And somewhere in the space between the silence and the words, something began to shift. Clara started bringing other things. A crossword puzzle she couldn't finish. A story about a customer at the coffee shop where she worked. A question about whether he preferred autumn or spring. Small things, easy things. But each one felt like a thread being woven into something larger, something neither of them had named yet. One evening, about a month in, Thomas surprised himself by asking a question. "Why do you keep coming here?" Clara looked at him, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. She set it down slowly, honestly, "Because I was tired of pretending I was okay," she said finally. Thomas felt something tight in his chest. Not pain, not quite, but close. "I do," he said. Winter came early that year, dusting the streets with a thin layer of white that melted by noon, but returned every night like a promise. The diner took on a different quality, in the cold warmer somehow, more inviting. The windows fogged up from the heat inside, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon seemed richer, more comforting. Thomas and Clara kept their routine, but now the silence between them was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of all of the things they didn't need to say. Thomas had been sitting there for 20 minutes, his pot pie growing cold, his coffee refilled twice. Didn't know how to explain that, yes, he had been worried. That the idea of sitting alone again, after weeks of not being alone, had filled him with a kind of quiet dread he hadn't anticipated. A little, he admitted. Clara's expression softened. I'm here now. I know. She ordered her coffee. They sat together. And Thomas felt the tightness in his chest ease, just a little. They were sitting together on a particularly cold December night, the kind where the wind rattled the windows and made the warmth inside feel like a small miracle. Thomas had just finished his meal, and Clara was working on her second cup of coffee, her hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. Can I ask you something? She said. Thomas looked up. A question he knew would come eventually, but had hoped might stay buried. He was quiet for a long time. So long that Clara started to think he wasn't going to answer. But then he spoke. I had a wife, he said. Margaret. We were married for 42 years. Clara didn't say anything, just listened. We used to eat dinner together every night, same time, same table. At home usually, but sometimes we'd go out. To this diner, actually. Clara's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Thomas nodded. Me too. They sat in silence for a while. Not the comfortable silence they had grown used to, but something heavier. Something that needed space to breathe. Finally, Clara spoke. I was supposed to have dinner with her that night, but I canceled because I had to work late. I never got to say goodbye. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same weight he carried reflected back at him. That's why you sit with me, he said. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded. I think so. I saw you sitting here night after night, and I knew. I knew what that looked like. And I didn't want either of us to keep doing it alone. Thomas felt something shift inside him. Something that had been locked tight for 3 years began, very slowly, to loosen. But it meant everything. You don't have to thank me, she said, but he did. Because she had given him something he thought he had lost forever. She had given him a reason to stay. Christmas came and went. The diner put up a small plastic tree near the register, decorated with mismatched ornaments and a string of lights that blinked unevenly. Diane, the waitress, wore a Santa hat for the entire month of December. They both had their reasons. But on Christmas Eve, Clara brought a small wrapped package and set it on the table between them. What's this? He unwrapped it carefully, preserving the paper as if it might be needed again. Inside was a simple frame, and inside the frame was a photograph. It was a picture of the diner, taken from across the street, the window glowing warm against the cold night outside. I took it a few weeks ago, Clara said. I thought you might like it. Thomas stared at the photograph, at the light, at the window. At the corner table where 2 people sat across from each other, barely visible but undeniably there. It's perfect, he said, his voice thick. Clara smiled. Merry Christmas, Thomas. Merry Christmas, Clara. The new year arrived quietly. No fireworks, no resolutions. Just the steady continuation of what had already begun. About books and weather and childhood memories. About Margaret and Clara's mother. There's something comforting about routine, you know? Seeing the same faces, knowing their orders before they say them. Thomas smiled. I know. What about you? Clara asked. Watching kids figure out what they thought about the world. He paused. After Margaret died, I retired. Couldn't face going back without her. She used to help me grade papers. Read the essays I brought home. She said she learned more from my students than she ever did in school. She sounds wonderful. She was. There was no sadness in his voice when he said it. Just truth, just memory. February brought a cold snap that froze the pipes in Thomas's building and turned the streets into skating rinks. Do you mind if I work while we sit? She asked. I have some scheduling stuff I need to finish. Of course not. Why do you keep coming here? To the diner, I mean. You could work from home. Or from your coffee shop. Clara closed her laptop slowly, considering the question. Because this feels like the only place where I don't have to be anything, she said. At work, I have to be the manager, the problem solver, the person who has all the answers. At home, I have to be the daughter who's okay, the friend who's moved on. But here, she looked around the diner, then back at him. Here, I can just be me, messy and tired and still figuring it out. And that's enough. Everywhere else, I'm the widower, the sad old man who lost his wife. People look at me and see grief, see pity. But here with you, I'm just Thomas. Thomas. Clara reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Good, she said, because Thomas is exactly who you should be. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, as if winter didn't want to let go. The snow melted into slush, then into muddy puddles, then finally disappeared altogether. Trees began to bud. The days grew longer, and the diner, which had been a refuge from the cold, became a refuge from the brightness, from the world waking up and demanding participation. Thomas and Clara kept their routine, but something had shifted between them. The grief that had brought them together was still there, still present, but it no longer defined every moment. They could laugh now, could joke, could talk about the future without feeling like they were betraying the past. One night in April, Clara brought a flyer. There's a community garden starting up a few blocks from here, she said. Never tried, but I thought it might be nice. Getting my hands dirty, growing something. She paused. Do you want to come with me? To the orientation meeting? Thomas hesitated. It had been a long time since he had done anything outside his routine. A long time since he had put himself in a room full of strangers. But Clara was looking at him with hope in her eyes, and he realized he didn't want to say no. Okay, he said. Clara's face lit up. Really? Really? And just like that, the world got a little bit bigger. The community garden was a small plot of land wedged between two apartment buildings, and people like Thomas and Clara who didn't quite fit into either category, but were looking for something to belong to. The organizer, a woman in her 50s named Joanne with dirt perpetually under her fingernails, explained the rules. Each volunteer would be assigned a bed. Thomas found himself surprisingly interested. He hadn't thought about growing things in years, but as Joanne talked about tomatoes and basil and the satisfaction of watching something you planted actually thrive, he felt a small spark of something he thought had died with Margaret. Curiosity, possibility. After the meeting, I think we should do it, he said, and so they did. The garden became part of their routine. On Saturdays, they would meet at the plot in the morning, armed with gloves and hand tools and a growing knowledge of what different seedlings needed to survive. Thomas discovered he had a knack for tomatoes. Clara fell in love with herbs, basil, and cilantro, and mint that grew wild and fragrant. They worked side by side, mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Productive, peaceful, the kind of silence that comes from shared purpose. Other gardeners would stop by to chat, to offer advice, to admire the progress. Thomas found himself talking to people again, learning their names, sharing tips, laughing at jokes. It was strange at first, uncomfortable even, but Clara was always there, a steady presence that made everything feel safe. Thomas looked up, soil on his hands, sweat on his forehead. Different how? Lighter, she said. Like you're not caring as much as you used to? Thomas thought about it. She was right. He did feel lighter. Not because the grief was gone, it wasn't, and he suspected it never would be, but because he had learned to carry it differently, to make room for other things. For growth, for connection, for life. You did that, he said. Clara shook her head. No, you did. I just sat down at your table. That was everything, Thomas said quietly. Clara smiled and went back to her planting. But Thomas saw the way her eyes glistened, bright red tomatoes hanging heavy from their stems, bees buzzing lazily from flower to flower. The diner installed a new air conditioning unit that rattled and hummed but mostly worked. Sitting at the corner table by the window, sharing meals and stories and the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. One night in July, Clara arrived with news. What does that mean? It means I'll be managing 2 locations now. More responsibility, better pay. Also means longer hours, at least for a while. Thomas felt a small flicker of worry. Will you still be able to come here? Clara reached across the table and took his hand. Of course. I might be late sometimes, but I'll be here, I promise. And she was, because the diner and Thomas had become as essential to her as breathing. The community organized a potluck, and everyone brought dishes made from what they had grown. Thomas made a simple tomato salad, sliced thick with olive oil and fresh basil. Clara brought a pesto she had made from her mint and basil, bright green and fragrant. People gathered around picnic tables, eating and laughing and celebrating the small miracle of having created something together. Clara was across the garden, talking to Joanne and a young couple with a toddler, her face animated and happy. A silent acknowledgement, look at us. Look at what we've built. After the potluck, as the sun was setting and the other gardeners were packing up, Thomas and Clara walked through the rows of plants, admiring the work they had done. He told her about how Margaret had loved flowers, but could never keep a houseplant alive. How she had laughed at her own failures, loudly and without shame. How she had believed that trying was more important than succeeding. Clara listened, and when he was finished, she said, I wish I could have met her. She always had a soft spot for stubborn, kind-hearted people who didn't know how special they were. Clara blushed. I'm not. You are, Thomas interrupted gently. You saved my life, Clara. You know that, right? They stood there in the fading light, surrounded by the things they had grown, and let themselves feel the fullness of it, the loss, the healing, the gratitude. The garden began its slow decline, the vibrant greens fading to browns and golds. But there was beauty in the ending, too, a kind of peace in watching things come full circle. Thomas and Clara continued their routine at the diner. Open it? Inside was a compass, old and brass and beautiful. Thomas looked at her, this woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. I would like that very much, he said. They started taking walks on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes they had a destination, a museum, a park, a bookstore Clara had read about. Sometimes they just wandered, following streets they had never been down, discovering neighborhoods they didn't know existed. They slipped into the back row just as the congregation was singing a hymn. Thomas didn't know the words, but he listened, letting the music wash over him. Beside him, Clara was quiet, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently. When the service ended, they stayed seated while everyone else filed out. As they walked out into the cold afternoon, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt found. Winter came again. The second winter of their friendship. But this one was different. There was no loneliness in the cold now. No dread at the thought of long dark evenings, because Thomas wasn't alone anymore. Diane insisting they have pie on the house. A New Year's Eve spent watching the countdown on the small television above the counter, toasting with coffee instead of champagne. And when the new year arrived, they both felt it. The sense that something had truly shifted, that they were no longer just surviving, they were living. One night in February, Clara arrived at the diner with an announcement. I'm thinking about going back to school, she said. That's perfect for you. You think so? I know so. Clara smiled. It's going to be hard. I'll have to work and study at the same time. I won't have as much free time. We'll figure it out, Thomas said. We always do, and they did. Spring arrived for the second time, and with it, the garden woke up again. Thomas and Clara returned to their plot, clearing away the dead growth from the previous year and preparing the soil for new seeds. Other gardeners welcomed them back, asking about their winter, sharing plans for the coming season. It felt like coming home. One Saturday in April, as they were working side by side, Clara said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About how much has changed in less than 2 years." "It does feel different," he agreed. "I don't feel stuck anymore," Clara said quietly. "I don't feel like I'm just going through the motions. I feel like I'm actually here, present, alive." Thomas set down his trowel and looked at her. "Me too, thank you," Clara said. "For what?" "For letting me sit at your table." Thomas smiled. "Thank you for sitting." The months continued to pass. Summer returned, hot and bright. The garden flourished. Clara started her classes and excelled, her natural empathy and understanding making her a standout student. Thomas began volunteering at the library, helping with a literacy program for adults. About showing up for each other day after day, meal after meal, conversation after conversation. You two found each other here, and that's something special. After Diane walked away, Thomas and Clara sat in silence, letting her words settle over them. "She's right," Clara said finally. "This place is special." "It is," Thomas agreed. "But I think we made it special. We could have met anywhere. But we met here, and we kept coming back. That's what made it matter." Clara nodded, understanding. "Do you think we would have found each other anyway, if I hadn't walked in that night?" Thomas considered the question. "I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But I'm grateful we didn't have to find out." "Me too." The third autumn arrived. The leaves turned golden red. The air grew crisp. The garden prepared for its seasonal rest. And Thomas and Clara continued their routines, the dinners, the walks, the Saturday mornings in the garden, the quiet evenings reading side by side. But something was different now. There was an ease to their friendship that hadn't been there before. A depth, a knowing. They had grieved together, healed together, grown together, and somewhere along the way, they had become family. One night in late October, Clara brought a photo album. "I want to show you something," she said. She opened the album to reveal pictures of her mother, young and vibrant in some, older and tired in others, but always smiling, always present. "She would have liked you," Clara said. "Who keeps showing up even when it's hard." The diner put up its crooked little tree. Diane wore her Santa hat. The world turned cold and white. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged gifts at the diner. Clara gave Thomas a leather journal, the pages blank and waiting. "For your thoughts," she said. Thomas gave Clara a framed photograph, a picture of the two of them in the garden, surrounded by tomatoes and basil, dirt on their hands, smiles on their faces. "So you never forget where we started," he said. Clara kept sitting across from him. And together, they built a life that neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. A life made of small moments, shared meals, long walks, grief acknowledged, joy discovered. A life that proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone sit at your table. Because in the end, we are all just looking for a place to belong. A person who sees us. A corner of the world where we don't have to be anything other than ourselves. Someone who knew that loneliness doesn't have to be permanent, and connection doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Years later, when people would ask Thomas how he had survived the loss of his wife, the young woman with a canvas jacket and determined eyes, he would think of all the dinners they had shared, all the silences and conversations, all the ways they had saved each other without ever saying the words. And he would smile because he knew the truth. We save each other by showing up, by sitting down, by staying. We save each other by being brave enough to not be alone. And in a small diner on the corner of Fifth and Maple, at a table by the window where the light falls just right, two people found each other in their grief and built something beautiful in its place. Not a cure for loneliness, not a replacement for what was lost, but a new beginning, a different kind of family, and another willing to let them stay.